Hello, and welcome to my podcast, Good Grief. My name is Dr. Christine Malone, and in this podcast, we talk about trauma, tragedy, and survival. In each episode, I will interview someone that has gone through grief in some way, and we will discuss the impact it has had on their life. By sharing these stories, we hope that others won't feel alone should they be going through similar situations. Enjoy. Okay, listeners, thank you so much for joining me for this podcast. My guest today is going to tell us a story about his loss. He lost his grandfather, and then kind of how he's channeled that grief into a project that has helped him as well as people that he's working with. So, if you would like to introduce yourself, and we'll start with if you could just tell us a bit about your grandfather.
Yeah, thank you. My name is Andrew. I am host of the podcast Our Last Mill. Grandfather, his name was AJ, and he's just an amazing guy. He was a very funny, loving man. He just always growing up, he was just always goofy and silly. He was also incredibly hardworking and caring and compassionate. Um, he was the kind of person that, growing up I looked up to and really wanted to be more like. And now that I'm older and he's gone, he's somebody I still look back at and think I want to be like him as much as I can. Um, you know, he
Wait, go ahead.
yeah, he did a lot for the community around him, growing up. Uh, about 2 years ago, in the end of 2020, he was diagnosed with a very aggressive form of cancer, and he passed a few months later from it in May. And one of the things about it was that it felt really fast from the time that he was diagnosed until the time that he passed away, but it also felt incredibly slow and painful just because it just happened so fast. But it felt like it was just time was just dragging. It was this really weird just feeling of both worlds where he's like, hey, he's going to the doctor, to he's sick, to he's no longer here, but at the same time seeing somebody who was even in his 80s, almost 90s, so full of life, just slowly that being drained from them was just really, really difficult.
Yeah. First thing, his initials AJ. Were you named after him with Andrew, or is that just a coincidence?
I think it's just a coincidence. And it's funny, my middle initial was J as well, so when I
Ah,
was a kid I thought that was the case, but I think it's just coincidence. And his name was AJ. It didn't stand for something. His name was AJ.
that was
And
actually
I've joked with my wife before that he was born in the Depression. They couldn't afford more letters for a name back then. So
That's funny. Now he got sick, you said in 2020. So did COVID prevent you from being able to visit with him or anything, or did that impact that time period at all due to that horrible virus?
okay, COVID. He and my grandmother both contracted COVID at one point, and they both were in the hospital for it and came out. Um, COVID. We were trying to follow all the rules. So we were quarantined. We weren't going out. My wife, my daughter, and I, we were staying just cooped up in a little apartment. I will say when he got sick though, and this is irresponsible, I know, but when you're grieving, you're not thinking straight. We got a phone call one day that, hey, he's not going to make it through the day. So we drove an hour and a half to go to be with him. It's kind of calling in the family. Um, we wore masks the entire time, and damned, he didn't. He lived that day. I say I'm laughing, and I don't want to sound callous. It just we were just so shocked. We got called and said like he's not going to make it through the day, and then we get there and he's joking with people and being jovial. Um, but it did make it harder to go and actually see him in person. So one of the last times I ever saw him alive was a FaceTime call with my aunt, and he it was really hard because he didn't look like himself. He didn't seem like himself. He didn't even seem conscious. And I hate that that's one of the last memories I have of him alive, is that it was through a phone, and I don't even think he realized he was on a phone. Um that was tough.
Yeah, that I've heard a lot of stories in my interviews of people who things like that happened during COVID and how it prevented them from spending time with their loved one at the end, which just further Makes me angry about COVID,
Yeah.
but totally different story. So, so even though he was, elderly and so on, and we don't obviously we know people don't live forever. How you didn't expect him to get sick and pass so soon after his illness, but how has his passing kind of impacted you in your own life? So were you like used to call him for advice or something, and now you don't, or anything along those lines where it's kind of you've had to kind of adjust to a new normal with him gone?
So, it's I didn't necessarily call him for advice all the time, but he was that voice kind of growing up that he would always, my cousins and I, he would always kind of talk to us about, the way you should do things. And when I say that, I mean the most basic advice was, you gotta work hard, you gotta, make as much money as you can, you gotta be good to other people, things like that. He he really was the epitome of, he pulled himself up out of nothing and made something out of himself. He left home at the, I think, at the age of 13 is what my uncle told me after he'd passed, with just $2 or $3 in his pocket. And by the time he passed, he owned a successful business that he'd run for probably 50 years. He had multiple properties that he had bought and renovated and rented out and sold. He was a self-made man in every sense of the word, but he also was a very giving man. At his funeral, I remember there were stories told, during the eulogy of just things he had done for people, um, just acts of kindness. A tenant who lost her job around Christmas time, and he went and dropped off a bunch of groceries and things like that, and just, didn't charge him rent for a month. Just little things like that. And that was just one story, but there were all kinds of stories of him doing these good deeds for people, but not doing it for any kind of recognition. So I have really, since his passing, I've really tried to take on as much of that as I can. I've always tried to have that mindset of, you should do good when you can, if you can, for no other reason than it's the right thing to do. There should be no other reason to do a good deed other than just it needs to be done. But hearing the way he lived his life, even more, and knowing that there was just so much I didn't know that he did, I've really tried to be inspired to do more of that. Um, I can also talk to you too about the podcast that I have now and how that kind of was born out of, my grieving process after his passing.
Yes, we're definitely going to get there. Two things came to mind with what you were talking about, and that is the legacy that he's left with all the things that he did and how that has impacted not only the people he helped, but also you as, his grandson, to really realize what a good person he was. Um, and the other thing is that there were things that you found out about him on that realm that you didn't know about, which speaks to the fact that he didn't brag about it. He didn't, tell you about it. It was just him, right?
Yeah.
He was just doing what he did because of who he was, and it wasn't like he was looking for accolades or credit or something. He was just a genuinely good person with an amazing work ethic, and probably because of him, the whole, going out on his own at such a young age and becoming successful. I think people in that demographic, um, certainly tend to be a different breed than what we see
Yeah.
today, for sure. So yes, I do want to get into your podcast because I know you started your podcast after your grandfather passed. So kind of take us through that process. How did you get from, I'm going through this grieving process to, hey, I'm going to start a podcast. And then your podcast has to do with last meals. So I want you to kind of talk about, where did that come from? How did you link grief to food, and how did that come about?
Yeah. So, he passed away in May of 2021, and I started the podcast in May of 2022. It took a full year for the idea to kind of form and turn into something tangible. And, on one hand, I knew I wanted to, for the longest time, I wanted to do a podcast. That's something I've wanted to do for years, just because I listen to a lot of podcasts. I love them. I enjoy them. But I never knew what I wanted to do, and it's so saturated. Like, finding something that you feel passionate enough to speak about at length is difficult. I'm sure you've experienced that. And just one night, it just kind of clicked, because for a long time after his passing, it's one of those things. It doesn't, it hits you like waves. in that, if you're sitting on the beach, it's not just one giant wave that comes in and then it's done. It's multiple waves, and some are bigger than others. So you might have a day that it just hits you like a ton of bricks that, he is gone and that is it. And it makes it hard to do anything. It makes it hard to focus. You have some smaller waves where you're riding with your daughter and she says like something like, "Hey, do you remember Papa? He was really nice, wasn't he?" And it's like, "Yeah, baby, he was really nice." And it's sad, but it's a little bit sweeter. So it's like waves. But one night it just kind of hit me that, I was thinking about him, and one of the things I thought about was, food. And it's because I am a food person. I love food. When people go on vacation and tell me about, the first thing I ask is, "What did you eat?" I love food. I love talking about it. And I associated a lot of foods with him and with a lot of people I care about. So growing up, I didn't get to spend a lot of time with my extended family. But when we did, it was usually around the holidays. And if you think about it, with the holidays, what's the centerpiece of that? It's always a big meal. It's Thanksgiving, it's Christmas, it's something like that. Additionally, he made Brunswick stew, which is was a kind of a signature of his. And if you don't know what Brunswick stew is, I'm not going to try to explain it because I'm not going to do it justice. But essentially, it's meat, vegetables, soup, really good. I would highly recommend, if you can try it or if you can make it, do it. It's great. But I just remember thinking, that there were certain foods that I just remembered specifically thinking about him or about my grandmother who was in really poor health at the time. And it just started to click for me that there are just so many foods I associated with people still living too. My mother, I associate chicken and dumplings with her because that was her signature dish growing up, and it's a thing I still love. For my grandmother, it was bologna sandwiches, it was fried cornbread, it was little Debbie donut sticks. She just passed in December of last year, and I still will sometimes, if I see these little Debbie donut sticks, I don't even like them because they are so sweet. I'll still buy them sometimes just to eat them and make me think about her. And
Yes,
so
that's
it's there was a couple months ago, I was at a gas station near the house, and I was helping an older woman. She was having trouble figuring out one of the soda fountains, and I helped her. And it just kind of, in the back of my head, it just made me think about my grandmother. And then I saw the little Debbie donut sticks right by the counter whenever I was waiting to check out, and I was like, okay, I'm just gonna take this as a sign from the universe. And I got home and my wife saw them in my hand, and she knew, it's like, okay, he's in that space right now.
yeah,
Um, but
that's
yeah, and I'm sorry, I got off topic there. I'm sorry,
oh,
but
oh, oh, I love it. As you know, I mean, I was a guest on your podcast, and when I first heard about what you do, I was really kind of like, how does grief and food go together? So I was kind of confused, and I thought, well, what could I even talk about on your podcast? What do I even have with food? And I talked with my daughter, and she said, "Well, Mom, what about this and what about that?" And she had all these things that she remembered from growing up with, my father and then her dad, which is who you and I talked about. Um, and I went, "Oh my gosh, you're so right. There is a lot of connection there." And it surprised me because it hadn't occurred to me. I think you're in a little niche there where I don't think I don't think there's another one like you out there. Where it kind of surprised me. Yeah, there is not only that connection, but I'm a big fan of, when it comes to grief, thinking about a lot of those positive memories because we have them, right? I mean,
yeah.
yes, grief is there and it's not going away, but we can think about those positive memories. And a lot of my positive memories for people that I've lost are surrounding food, right? I mean, food is comfort, food is family, all that kind of stuff. So it really, then it struck me like, oh my gosh, you're so right. You're so onto something here with this food thing, which was really something for me. So I was going to ask you, your food memories with Grandpa, but it sounds like the Brunswick stew was kind of the thing. So do you make that today, or is that anything you do, or your wife makes, or you go buy somewhere, or how do you bring that memory back?
So that's not something I make. Although, I got to say this. I've got whenever my grandmother passed, I told you December of last year, a couple months ago, I went to visit my aunt who was there with them at the end, and she's living in that home now, and she had pulled some stuff aside for me to look through, and I got to grab a couple of my grandmother's cookbooks, and I was going through them, and I also found a printed out recipe for Brunswick stew, And
Oh,
I don't know if it's the one that my grandfather used, but I saw it. I was like, I'm keeping that. That's I'm going to frame that and put it on the wall in my office. Um, I don't make the Brunswick stew, but something that my extended family is going to do is this September we're going to get together, and we're basically going to do a big Brunswick stew thing for the family. He used to do that, and so
um,
we're going to do that this year, which is going to it's going to be hard. I know it's going to be hard, but it's also going to be really nice to be with other people who loved him and who have that same connection to that thing.
yeah.
Um,
And
but
that
it's
and
you know
that food reminds everyone of him.
yeah. But it is funny that you mentioned that about the how, it I know it seems like an odd concept, but I've found in 30 plus episodes now that I've had that every person I've had on, there is a yeah, that was an odd thing. And then I thought about it and I realized that, my father, my grandfather, my husband, my wife, my whoever, there was some food that they loved. And I've had so many people who've told me that anytime they eat a certain food that had been special to somebody, whether I had one woman on who she lost her husband and his big thing was ordering ribs anywhere they went. So she'll still order a rack of ribs and
Mm,
just think like, okay, I'm doing this for him. I'm enjoying this on his behalf. It's I've just heard so many different stories of people that enjoy a certain specific food because of a loved one. And when they eat it, it's that feeling of like, okay, they're still kind of with me and I still get to enjoy something for them with them.
yeah, yeah. For me, I mean, what I'm thinking about with my father used to make this red clam chowder every year for Christmas Eve, and my father was not, a chef by any stretch of the imagination. It was just canned tomatoes and canned potatoes and tomato soup and so on. And I remember asking him before he passed, what's your recipe for that red clam chowder? And it was so insanely simple that I thought, okay, well, it's going to be easy to make. And it's actually not one of my favorite dishes, but when I make it, it reminds me so much of my dad that I smile the entire time I make it. And my sister and I, when she lives with me, and when I make it, she'll say, "Oh my gosh, this is dad's soup," and we just talk about him and our memories of him, not even just about this, the soup or when he'd make the soup, but the soup itself brings us to that space of, remembering him and, what we miss about him and the things we loved about him, which really makes that connection, if you will. So my
Yeah.
point being, the food doesn't even have to be something you really love and cherish. It's just like, oh my gosh, when I have this, it reminds me of this person and that I lost and the memories that I have. So that's what I think is really cool about what you do. So I'm curious to know, how has your podcast and the interviews you're doing, how has that helped you with your own grieving process, and so on? How does it make you feel in doing these interviews with people?
So it's helped me a lot in that it's made it a little more normal to grieve, which is yeah, we don't do a very good job of this as a society. I don't know if it's a Western thing, if it's a modern day, I don't know, and above my pay grade. Um, but we don't do a very good job of grieving, and we don't even do a good job of watching other people grieve. When my grandfather passed, I was really lucky that my boss, great guy, and he'll never hear this, so this isn't even me sucking up, but he he related because his grandmother had passed earlier on in his career, and nobody at work said anything to him, so he made sure to check on me that I was okay, and that meant a lot. But even then, there's still that you could tell he didn't know what to say, and there's nothing to say. There's no right thing to say to that person in that moment. But I wanted to normalize the idea of having a conversation about grief and just not making people feel alone, because there is this sense of otherness, and I talk about this on my show sometimes, but there feels like this sense of otherness when you lose somebody, and especially when other people know that you've lost them, because it almost is like you're walking around and you've got the ick on you. You
Mm,
know, it's like you remember the cartoons where you've got somebody that just has a cloud hanging over them. It almost feels like that, and it's not an intentional thing, but you don't get to just be normal, which it sucks, but you don't get to just be normal when you're grieving. And it's not even just it's an over and done with thing. There's not a switch that gets flipped. It is very much a progression of, okay, you finally feel a little bit better at some point and you don't even realize it. And so I wanted to try to have these conversations, and my goal is always that for the guest that comes on, I hope that they benefit from getting to talk about somebody. And I've seen so many times or heard so many times, had somebody tell me, thank you for this because it's allowed me to, talk about somebody I haven't talked about in a while. And you can tell that they appreciate that they've gotten to speak about them. And I'm glad I get to give that to that one individual person, but I'm also hopeful that, the whoever listens to it, that they get something out of it. It just that it makes them think about somebody that matters to them and makes them think of a memory. If somebody were to tell me I went and made a dish that my grandfather used to make that I haven't thought about in forever because I listened to your podcast, I would love that. If somebody told me I was very intentional about, cooking a meal with my child tonight so that they've got that memory in the kitchen with me and they've got that dish that they associate. I want people to build those memories. I want them to be able to reflect on them, I guess.
Yeah, I love that. And I want to also point out, first of all, I totally agree with you on our society is not comfortable with grief. I mean, if you think about it, most employers allow like, what is it, 3 days off for bereavement when you've lost someone, as
Yeah.
if 3 days, which I know is, go to the funeral or whatever, but 3 days is not enough time to really grieve someone that you cared about. So I think our society, our culture here in the US is extremely uncomfortable. Actually, I don't think I know with topic of grief. And, I know for myself, I'd never wanted anybody to feel sorry for me. So it's like, I don't want to talk about my grief because I don't want you to be like, oh, and then feel sorry for me. However, if I talk about my grief and you say, well, what are your memories about that person, or what kind of foods did you guys do today, eat together, whatever. Those are my happy memories rather than having someone say, I'm sorry for your loss and then give me that look of pity, which I personally despise. So I
Yeah.
love that angle of, how do you bring, your happy memories up because they're there. And I know from my own grief journey that, eventually you can get to the point where the happy memories outweigh the pain of the grief. And that's when healing really starts to begin, starts to really take off, and you can remember that person without pain each time. So, I love the idea of, yeah, I can make my dad's red clam chowder and it makes me sad for a moment, but it also makes me smile. Or like in my case, Thanksgiving's my favorite holiday. And I remember
Yeah.
my dad would come up every year to my house for Thanksgiving. He would tell me, Christine, you make the best stuffing I've ever had. So and I really, it's kind of funny because I think I'm the only one in my family that eats stuffing to this day, but I make it and I sit there with tears in my eyes thinking about my dad. Actually, it's making me tear up just now just thinking about it. And I make that stuffing and think, well, dad loved my stuffing and it is good stuffing and I love it too. And it's like his legacy, if you will, with, how his memory has gone on in my life. And those happy times, which again, tears aren't always sad. They can be happy too. So
Yeah.
I really appreciate you making that connection and doing what you're doing. So um, I know we're going to put a link to your podcast so that guests that would like to talk to you or possibly be interviewed by you about their stories can reach out. But I'm curious, as someone that went through a loss of someone you really cared about, especially, I know it was a short period of time, and as you mentioned, it felt like a long period of time, but, what would your, advice be to that person? Especially in this anticipatory grief where they're going to pass. What would you recommend? What would you say? Hey, do this or don't do this on those lines.
Yeah, and that's hard. Because I feel like with my grandfather and my grandmother both, I went through two very different forms of it. With my grandfather, I knew it was coming and there was a lot more sad there. With my grandmother, and it could be because I was still a year and a half from my grandfather, so I was still dealing with that. That one hurt in a different way just because it just felt like it was piling on. But I would say if you're anticipating it, go ahead and talk as much as you're comfortable. um I think therapy is huge. I'm a big proponent of therapy. Just to have a non-biased person that you can talk to and vent to is great. A journal or something. Just I think trying to sit with it and just let it sit on your chest, I think hurts, and it does more damage than good. um that said, I'm a firm believer too that there is no right or wrong way to grieve. There are ways that are healthier than others. Turning you know to drinking, to drugs, probably not the healthiest way to do it. I'm not going to say you're wrong for needing some kind of escape. It's just probably not the healthiest way to do it. So I would say, trying to find something that you can get even just like the smallest amount of pleasure in, do it. If it's, just cracking jokes, and don't feel guilty about that either. That's the other thing. Don't feel bad that you're trying to feel better. I think is incredibly important. Um, and also just talk to anybody you can. Anyone that'll listen to you. It's hard sometimes to find that person. I would even say if you know somebody is going to go through it, I mean, just reach out to them. My wife was incredible through the process because she gave me space when I needed it. She talked to me when I needed it. My daughter, at 4 years old, 5 years old, she showed so much emotional intelligence just in her ability to be comforting. Um, that's a really long-winded way to say it's okay to lean on the loved ones a bit.
Yeah,
That's
no,
when you need them.
I completely agree with you. And I know I'm a very person, and I don't rely on other people for other things. So to me, I almost think it's a weakness to, you know, need somebody. But I have found that having those support systems, whether it's good friends, family, a therapist, whatever it might be, is extremely helpful. And sometimes just, like if someone is going through that, and you're the bystander, the family member, the coworker, whatever, is to do like you said, kind of reach out and say, hey, this I've been through something like this. If you want to talk, you can talk, and then but be sincere about it. So I think a lot of us in this society, when someone's going through grief, we that whole I'm sorry for your loss, but to actually sit and listen to them, right? To say, well, tell me more about that person, or how are you feeling, or how can I help you? One of the techniques that I like to do with people when I know they're grieving is not just ask them what I could do, but tell them what I'm going to do. So I'm going to
Yeah.
bring you some meals. Would you rather have me bring breakfast, lunch, or dinner? So I'm not asking you to find in your head what you want me to do because you're so busy with so much else right now and you're grieving. I'm telling you, I'm going to do this, which would be better, right? I'm going to bring you this. What would you rather me do? I'd like to pick up your kids from school and take them to the park. Would you rather me do that on Tuesday or Thursday? So it's kind of a sense of how can I help you in a way where I'm actually giving you suggestions. This is how I'm going to do it. And really listening to people in that time of grief. And I'm really glad you had your spouse for that. Um, I know that's not always the case, and I know
Yeah.
again in this culture, grieving it's just not a comfortable topic for a lot of people, which is too bad because none of us are getting out of this life alive. So
Yeah.
everybody's going to go through the grieving process at some point in time. So, whether you're comfortable or not, you need to have those conversations. And not having them as the person who's grieving, I think you stick in that grieving groove, if you will, longer if you had those resources, people to talk to, your boss, being understanding, those kinds of things, rather than this robotic way that we tend to treat these things in our culture today.
Yeah. And one other thing I'd say there, because you kind of touched on this, me getting it out, but bottling it up, it's not going to go away. It might take a while, but it will bubble up and it will come out. And there's just that's just I think all there is to it. Like you're never going to fully get rid of it. You can't just ignore it, and it will go away. It will surface in some way.
Yeah, and a lot of times it sits there and festers if you don't do something with
Yeah.
it, right? So especially when you talk about, seeking, solace or whatever in, alcohol or whatever it might be, or other things that might be damaging, those are distractions rather than, just outright facing how you're feeling, which can be tough. I mean, I know, for example, in the grieving process, that being angry feels better than
Yeah.
actually owning the grief, right? So in some of the grief situations I've been in, I tried to be angry for a while because I thought, well, I'm more in power. I'm empowered with this anger. Whereas, of course, I'm expending on so much more energy being angry than if I would be doing if I would just get to the process of just, going through this and, um, accepting this thing or whatever it is and who I am in this new reality rather than being angry that this thing happened. So, I think, and I know you said you made the comment, not everybody grieves the same way and doesn't look the same from one person to another. And I think it's extremely important to realize. I know I had somebody tell me at one point in time in one of my episodes where I was grieving, well, you've been in this for enough time now. It's time for you to, start doing this. And I thought, well, how are you to tell me what I
Mm.
should be doing right now? Right? Maybe you did that, but this isn't maybe what's right for me. So, yeah, that's kind of one of my thoughts is to not judge people when they're in the grieving process and not say, well, you
No.
should be here or you shouldn't be there or you shouldn't be enjoying life. And how is it you're being happy when you take your kids to the movie when you should still be, sad or whatever? It's like, no, don't put that on other people because we're all very, very different and how we make that journey, if you will, as we go.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, Andrew, I want to thank you again so much for being my guest for this podcast. I absolutely love the concept of the podcast that you do. We'll be linking to it in the notes for this episode when it airs so that guests who might want to talk to you or look into what you do can reach out and kind of talk about it. Their last meal, if you will, with the people that they've lost and are missing. And for those listening, I want you to know, having been a guest on Andrew's show, it is a fun experience, and fun and grief don't necessarily sound like they go together, but they do. And it's okay to have fun associated with that grief process because you had fun with the person you lost, and that'll always be there.
Yeah. And I try to approach it as it's not we're not mourning someone, we're celebrating them. So
Yeah, and that's a great point too. It's a great point. All right, well, thank you so much for your time.
yeah, Christine, thank you so much for having me. It was such a pleasure.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Good Grief. To hear more about my personal story, please pick up a copy of my book, The Day I Became the Spider Killer, a memoir of trauma, tragedy, and survival, available in paperback, Kindle, and Audible via Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and other online book retailers.